What's happening, friends, and shalom, and welcome to this episode of The Watchdog. I am your host, CJ Cox, here to tell you that we are living in biblical times. Want to go ahead and remind you that you are watching this exclusively on the Synagogue News. We want to remind you guys to think like a Neanderthal and own the titles that your enemies like to throw at you, because if you're not going to, nobody else will. Thank you, everybody who is here today, whether you're watching this live with us very late. It's about 10:20 my time, which is mountain time, or if you are, watching this later on. Certainly do appreciate you tremendously. Anybody who is here, want to please ask that you like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified of every time that we go live. Of course, what good is a message without an audience to hear it? So when you're sharing this, please consider sharing it to all the different social media platforms which you frequent. And whilst you're in the business of frequenting social media platforms, please do consider getting on some of the alternative social media platforms that are trying to help us get on, get back to, a more free speech oriented internet. There was a time, of course, when free speech was definitely allowed on the internet. We are past that time, but we could potentially get back to that time if we use some of the alternative social media platforms that have been provided to us. If you're a fan of the Twitter style of social media, you can hop on Gab or Parler or Minds. Those all are definitely great sites which do respect your freedom of speech, unlike the recent Getter. You can also, if you're a big fan of Facebook, get on MeWe or Telegram. And if you are a big fan not only of YouTube, but of this show, please do consider getting on Rumble. Rumble is at some point going to be the permanent spot for this show. As we know, our days on YouTube are certainly limited. But nonetheless, not only would it be helpful for us and helpful for you if you're ever going to actually, if you're going to watch us, when we end up getting pulled, which will happen. YouTube will do it at some point. Not only will it help us and help you in that regard, but it'll also, of course, help the cause of freedom of speech in the United States of America and indeed in the world. You can't rely on governments to defend your freedom of speech. You can't rely on the companies that are taking your freedom of speech, but you absolutely positively can force people to respect your freedom of speech by punching them right in the dollars. So definitely consider getting on those different social media websites. Not spawned, but nonetheless, certainly do want to advocate that you guys do that. I want to go ahead and jump into our pre-article discussion today, which will be very short, but it's just a brief update on the Pastor Tony Spell situation. The good pastor has responded to the dismissal of his lawsuit against the Louisiana state government, and more particularly Louisiana's Democratic governor, John Bel Edwards. If you guys recall, on Wednesday, we were talking about how Pastor Spell had a lawsuit against the state, basically asking that he be paid for, them violating his liberties, in other words, that he receive recompense, or what would the word be? Restitution, I guess is the word, for the wrongs done against him by the state, at least as he perceives it, of course, which I definitely agree with. But nonetheless, that was tossed out by a Louisiana judge. And recently, it appears that, and the judge, by the way, his name is Brian Jackson. But recently, it appears that, and by recently, I mean today, yesterday, it appears that Pastor Tony Spell has actually said, yesterday was the 13th, right? Yeah, yesterday. It appears that Pastor Tony Spell has said that he is going to actually challenge this ruling. He's going to try and appeal to a higher court. I'm not 100% sure how that works in the case of civil suits, which this definitely is. But nonetheless, he says he is planning on appealing it to the higher courts. I think this is an incredibly important thing to appeal, because if you recall, if you were here on Wednesday, and if you're not, I'll go ahead and just inform you for the first time. The reason for the Louisiana Louisiana Judge Brian Jackson's shooting down of this lawsuit, right? The reason that he gave was that there is not an unrestricted right to religious assembly and that basically at all times that were relevant, the government of Louisiana was acting within what they reasonably considered to be their constitutional parameters of government, right? I don't, and I very much went into this on Wednesday's show. I don't agree with them at all. I think that's a total misinterpretation of the Constitution. In fact, I don't even think it is an interpretation of the Constitution. I think they just kind of tossed the First Amendment of the Constitution out. The First Amendment very clearly says that Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. So that is one aspect of the First Amendment, which very clearly says you have an unrestricted right to religious assembly. It also says Congress shall make no law restricting the right to peaceably assemble, which is another unrestricted right to religious assembly. So not only do you have an unrestricted right to assemble peaceably, but you also have an unrestricted right to practice your religion. And of course, numerous court cases have ruled that even though these amendments specify the federal government, state governments, city governments, community governments of any kind are not able to violate this Bill of Rights, right? So I absolutely agree that this needs to be challenged. I think it sets a very dangerous precedent for any judge or court or collection of judges or what have you to actually try and make the argument that the First Amendment does not say what it very clearly does say. I know the issue here is religious liberty and not abortion, but I do find it very ironic that we can find a right to abortion in the 14th Amendment when it certainly does not exist there. But we can't find a right to peaceably assemble in a church in the First Amendment, even though it's actually reiterated in two different ways. It's an absolutely astounding thing to me. But nonetheless, just want to inform you guys, Pastor Spell is planning on fighting back against this. I am hoping to see not only this challenged, of course, which it will be now, but also to see this overturned. As some of you may know, I'm very much in Pastor Spell's court here. And if you guys are also in Pastor Spell's court, I want to please encourage you to share not only this video and specifically this clip and clips of my other videos where I talk about Pastor Spell, but also share the different articles that he is mentioned in. Make this story relevant, basically, right? Share his videos, share the updates, get your friends talking about this sort of thing. I think it's a very important case. It's kind of a landmark case in a way, considering the fact that John MacArthur, James Coates, Art Pulowski, Tim Remington, while I appreciate all of them, they all managed to get out scot-free. So far, Tony Spell has not. Tony Spell was not only the first one to challenge the unconstitutional COVID mandates, but he's also the only one who's had long-term legal repercussions for it. So I think it's very important that we show our support for our brother, that we show our support for religious liberty, that we show our support for the unrestricted right of the people to peaceably assemble in religious gatherings. And yeah, that ends the pre-article discussion for today, but I just wanted to give you guys that little update here before we jump into what we have next. So let me go ahead and get my screen share up here real quick. Just one moment. All right, and this article is from our good friends over at the Christian Post, written by one Ryan Foley, and it says, Christian conservatives respond to John MacArthur comparing religious freedom to idolatry. And I think it's a good thing for us to talk about John MacArthur's comments right after talking about Tony Spell and his case, because, of course, the comparison of religious freedom to idolatry, while I think reading into it literally is probably going to lead you to a misinterpretation of what John MacArthur was trying to say, I also would like to share some heavy criticism for Pastor MacArthur, because frankly, if you don't mean the words that you said, then maybe you should say different words. And I think it's important for us to choose the right words in regards to this issue when we're talking about situations such as Pastor MacArthur himself has experienced and Pastor Spell is currently going through, namely situations in which our religious liberties, which are constitutionally enshrined, are being violated, right? But regardless, before we get into some of the criticisms I have, let's go ahead and jump into the article. Christian conservatives respond to John MacArthur comparing religious freedom to idolatry. Let me go ahead and get my camera on here. Just one moment. Excuse me. All right, let's get right into this article. So, Christian conservatives respond to John MacArthur comparing religious freedom to idolatry. And he did indeed do this. We'll go ahead and read the whole article here. Prominent pastor and theologian John MacArthur has come under fire after a video resurfaced of him taking issue with the idea of religious freedom, with some Christian speakers debating whether his comments were taken out of context. I don't believe that they were taken out of context. I do believe that he probably vocalized words which literally mean things that he was not trying to say, if that makes sense to you guys, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that criticism isn't going to be levied here at his feet today, because, again, if you meant something other than what you said, perhaps you shouldn't use the words that you did. But regardless, a video of one of MacArthur's sermons from early last year at California's Grace Community Church resurfaced over the weekend after Matthew Sheffield, who describes himself as a, quote, former right-wing activist now working to elevate new topics and voices against fascism, end quote, shared it on Twitter. Sorry, I got an itch here on my nose. Now, I do want to point out really quick that I don't think that Matthew Sheffield is a particularly trustworthy person. Just as an example, his definition of fascism would obviously include people just simply exercising their right to religious freedom, like Tony Spell and John MacArthur have done and been chastised for. He would probably consider me to be very much a fascist, as I am openly nationalistic and openly pro-life radical, as I like to describe myself. But the only reason that you would compare those kinds of things to fascism is because you don't know what fascism is. Fascism is an actual political ideology, a political philosophy. It makes certain claims. It has certain ideas as far as this is how you run a government, this is how you don't run a government. And to, label right-wingers as fascist simply because they're right-wingers is completely ridiculous. And of course, it ignores the fact that fascism is in fact very syncretic. It could not be properly placed on either the right or left spectrum. For example, it very much is egalitarian for the people who are within the ethnos. In other words, it's not totally egalitarian, but it is egalitarian for all men, women, children, different social classes, different positions that you might be born into or whatever, right? It's egalitarian for all of those, so long as you're in the same ethnos, right? So obviously that's something that's very comparable to left-wing dictatorships like you have in North Korea or China. Another element of fascism that is very left-wing is their ideas of socialism. They're very socialistic in economy, not entirely socialistic in economy, but definitely a lot more socialistic than what we would be comfortable with in modern America. But of course, things about fascism are also very right-wing. Like they are one of the key elements of fascism is nationalism. Nationalism is an inherently right-wing idea. So the point just to say, fascism does not belong neatly on either the left or right of the spectrum. If you want an actual idea of far-right extremism, things like monarchism and theocracy would be better representations of far-right extremism, whereas far-left extremism would be things like communist totalitarianism or anarchism, right? But fascism being one or the other, that's not true. Fascism is a radical form of what you could really refer to as political syncretism that takes elements of both left-wing and right-wing thought and tries to mesh them together to create a different, somewhat unique in a lot of ways, political ideology. And there's all that to say, that's sort of a tangent I got on, all that to say that this new trend of people like Mr. Sheffield just saying, oh, yeah, I'm fighting fascism. No, you're not. You never met a fascist in your life. Like, get over yourself, okay? You're not Captain America punching Hitler in the face on the comic book, my dude. You're some guy on Twitter. Frankly, I'm some guy on YouTube, so I'm not necessarily criticizing you. I'm just saying let's be honest about ourselves, right? That said, Matthew Sheffield sharing the video wouldn't mean anything if the video didn't exist, right? So just because he's not a necessarily trustworthy source, just because he's got this really ridiculous view that would label people like John MacArthur and Allie Beth Stuckey and myself and others as fascist, that doesn't mean that the video shared is somehow taken out of context or doctored in a way that makes it dishonest or anything along those lines. Video of one of MacArthur's sermons I just read that, sorry. Quote, extremist Christians love to claim that they're all about religious freedom, but the truth is that they hate the idea, end quote, Sheffield, the editor of The Flux and host of Theory of Change podcast, wrote. And then this is the article that he shared. Or not the article, the video that he shared, excuse me. Well, no, actually, I think this is the video. Yeah, sorry, this is the video he shared. This is a video talking about something else. I guess it's not. I don't know. I don't really know what it is, to be honest. I don't really care. I didn't watch the videos because I don't really care about that. I've seen the MacArthur sermon, right? So that's the important thing. You got to watch the whole thing in context. Quote, sometimes when they're in a safe space, they admit this, he added. Sheffield cited the video taken from January 2021 sermon as an example of what many Christians really think about the topic of religious freedom. In the video, MacArthur asserts that, quote, I don't even support religious freedom, end quote. He went on to allege that, quote, religious freedom is what sends people to hell, end quote. New quote, to say I support religious freedom is to say I support idolatry. It's to say I support lies. I support hell. I support the kingdom of darkness. You can't say that. No Christian with half a brain would say we support religious freedom, end quote. MacArthur suggested that Christians should proclaim that we support the truth as the crowd erupted into applause. He warned his congregation that, quote, if the new administration supports religious freedom, get ready. Persecution will be ramped up because the more supportive they are of the devil's lies, the less they're going to tolerate the scripture, end quote. He vowed that, new quote, we're not going to lobby for freedom of religion, asking what kind of nonsense is that, end quote. The clip concluded with MacArthur maintaining that we are in the world to expose those lies as lies. So, let's talk about these comments, right? Now, a lot of people have said, and you're going to see some people in this article try to defend this with this claim, that what MacArthur is actually saying is people specifically on the left-wing side, but also on the neoconservative side, tend to use religious liberty as a buzzword or a buzz term, I guess, because that wouldn't really be one word, right? As a buzz term, a dog whistle, if you will, against Christianity, right? So, for example, when you hear people say that, we shouldn't be allowing things like prayer in schools because of religious liberty, not prayer being led by a teacher per se, right? But just prayer in schools in a way that is, shall you say, mass, meaning there's more than one person doing it, right? Or when you talk about situations like, taking down a nativity statue or a Ten Commandments poster, in a court, or maintaining a behemoth statue on the grounds of a Capitol building or something along those lines, right? These are the kinds of things that people on the left-wing side and the neoconservative side tend to be supporting when they're saying we support religious liberty, right? What they tend not to be supporting on the flip side is things like Pastor Tony Spell or what happened to Pastor John MacArthur during the whole COVID situation. And that is what a lot of people took from John MacArthur's comments, saying that, what he's trying to say is there is a nefarious agenda out there that uses a group of people with a nefarious agenda, that uses the phraseology, religious freedom, religious liberty, separation of church and state, stuff like that, right? As a dog whistle to try and discredit or dissuade people from or try to make less public the Christian faith, while at the same time elevating other faiths. And if that's what he meant, I actually largely agree with that in a lot of different ways. It is certainly an interesting fact to note that there are tons of court cases, in fact, Supreme Court cases, talking about you're not allowed to put 10 Commandments up or nativity scenes up or crosses up on government property. Things like courts and government buildings like the Senate houses of your local state and stuff like that, right? But there's a very controversial behemoth statue, or excuse me, not behemoth. Behemoth is a creature. What's it called? what's it called? Baphomet. There you go, Baphomet. There's a very popular Baphomet statue on, I believe, the Louisiana Baton Rouge Capitol grounds, which, of course, is the same state that's currently persecuting Tony Spell. And nobody has said anything about it, right? With the exception of people who would be labeled by these same groups of people as right-wing extremists, right? If that's what Pastor John MacArthur means to communicate, then I would be in agreement with him, right? The thing is, that isn't what he said, right? That's not what he said. What he said is, I don't support religious liberty. If you support religious liberty, then you support all the different damnable things that come with false religion, which very much sounds like what he's saying is, if you support somebody's right to participate in a false religion, then you support the false religion itself. Therefore, if you don't support the false religion, then you should not support somebody's right to participate in the false religion. That's what it sounds like John MacArthur said. Did he mean that? Somehow I doubt it. Somehow I don't think that that's what John MacArthur, considering his most recent fight with the California state government, somehow I don't think that's what he was suggesting, right? But that's definitely what it sounds like he said. Let's just be perfectly clear about that. And this is one thing that I just have to say very plainly. If that isn't what he meant, then he needs to not choose his words like a moron. And I say that with respect. But if you meant something other than supporting people's supporting people's right to participate in false religion is supporting false religion. If you meant something different than that, then you should have chose words that didn't communicate exactly that, right? Especially in the year 2022 or 2021 in this particular case when this took place, right? Why do I say that? Well, because John MacArthur, you of all people know that what you have gone through, what Pastor Tony Spell has gone through, what Pastor Tim Remington has gone through, what Pastor James Coates has gone through in Canada, what Pastor Artur Pawlowski has gone through in Canada, is a direct violation of the concept of religious liberty. You even argued as much in court. But for some reason, you feel the necessity to make comments like this. I don't know. I don't get it. I think personally it was probably something that was just very stupidly worded. And again, I say that with respect. But it's a huge biff if that's not what he meant, right? Like, you chose the absolute worst collection of words you could have possibly chosen. You know what I'm saying? And by the way, friends, I am Reformed, right? So I'm not saying this just to pick on John MacArthur, right? He's somebody who is, it's somebody who I admire, basically, is what I'm trying to get at there. But I think that is what he communicated is certainly not something that we should support. If he meant something different, then he should communicate better, especially in a position like his where he runs a mega church with multi-thousands of people actually there, right? The other thing that you could say that he's trying to say is, well, if you support religious, like if, for example, if you would go to defend a Jewish synagogue's right to meet, aren't you defending the Jewish synagogue's right to go and do what they do, which is blaspheming the Lord, right? And you could say that he's supporting that. But of course, that would be just as ridiculous as saying, because I am in support of somebody running their business as they see fit, that means that I'm in support of people paying their employees an improper wage or not respecting employees' potential time off or being rude to employees or stuff like that. No, just because I support your right to do something like that, meaning the state shouldn't get involved if you do, that doesn't mean I think that's good, right? And I think that's a very obvious distinction that we should definitely be making. And again, especially in an age where we have pastors like Tony Spell fighting for their proverbial lives, so to speak, right? 3 years in jail is a long time, over this issue of religious liberty, right? And, of course, the other possibility here is that John MacArthur is just saying this for shock value, right? The reason he's choosing these words deliberately is because he wants everybody talking about what it is that he has to say. And while I have no issue with clickbait per se, so long as it's honest, in this case, it wouldn't be honest. So I would take issue with it. But regardless, we continue. MacArthur suggested that Christians should proclaim, I already read that, persecution will be ramped up because the more supportive they are of the devil's lies, the less they're going to tolerate the truth of Scripture. Excuse me. there is a level of truth to this in a way. But I certainly don't think that it is generally true, right? In other words, I think that if you have a society that is religiously tolerant, for example, the Persian Empire, the United States of America for most of its existence, though certainly not all of it, Great Britain for a long period of time, even Israel to a large extent. Obviously Israel has a lot of problems in the modern day. But even Israel to a large extent, if you look at these areas that are more religiously diverse, they do tend to have really strong, robust Christian communities, right? Like the community of Messianic Jews in Israel, like the evangelical Christian community here in the United States. That's considered to be amongst the most fundamentalist in the world, right? The Netherlands also has a very deeply fundamentalist grain in it, as does Great Britain, right? As do a lot of these countries. Of course, in Persia, we know that Israel back in the day was allowed to literally rebuild the Temple of Solomon and reinstitute worship. They had prophets and priests doing the priestly duty and all this other kind of stuff, right? So to say, well, because people are more tolerant of all these other lies, that means that they're going to be less tolerant of God's word. I don't think that history actually plays that out. Now, there is an exception to what I'm saying, though, which is if you have a society whose ears are very much tickled by the idea of, for example, homosexual marriage or abortion or religious pluralism or things like that, then if that's what they want, then of course what they don't want, almost by definition, would be the exclusivity, provided in the gospel, right? So there is a level of truth to what John MacArthur is saying here. But again, the way he has worded this does not communicate, I think, anything that is proper. Frankly, I think that this is something that nobody should try to defend, right? It was a stupid collection of words, and he needs to choose his words better. Especially when this is just absolute cannon fodder for the progressive left, right? Who's just having an absolute heyday with this stuff. Oh, famous Reformed theologian doesn't agree with religious freedom. Go figure, right? And frankly, John MacArthur ran headfirst into that wall, especially if it's not what he meant, right? If it is what he meant, then I guess he didn't. It's not running headfirst into a wall as much as it is just proclaiming what you actually mean to say. But if it's a mistake on his part, then it's just like rhinoceros charging into the wall, with seemingly no vision outside of your own tunnel. But back to the article. He vowed that we're not going to lobby for religious freedom, asking what kind of nonsense is that. And again, he said the whole thing about we are in the world to expose all those lies as lies. Prominent Christian commentators quickly condemned MacArthur's remarks, including former National Review writer and current senior editor of the Dispatch, David French. Lamenting MacArthur as disturbing, Francis took to Twitter to slam the astonishing arrogance in his statements as an astonishing lack of respect for dissent from his version of the truth. And I don't think, again, that MacArthur was actually trying to communicate that we need to have some kind of theocratic government. I just think that he articulated a point, probably looking for shock and awe, probably looking to get headlines, articulated a point poorly, frankly, articulated a point in such a way that the point which he meant to articulate, in fact, wasn't, and a new point which he probably didn't mean to articulate, in fact, was. French pushed back on the idea that MacArthur's words were taken out of context. Quote, my recent tweets critiquing MacArthur references words in context. Of course, that's what David French believes. And in his context, he really did say, I could never really concern myself with religious freedom. I wouldn't fight for religious freedom because I won't fight for idolatry. And that is a direct quote. Again, all of these, of course, are direct quotes. Brooke Medina, vice president of the conservative think tank John Locke Foundation. John Locke is actually the philosopher who, in the West, first articulated the idea of modern religious freedom. Fun fact. Reacted to MacArthur's comments by tweeting that, quote, Christian martyrs over the past 2 millennia would beg to differ, John, end quote. She alleged that by stating opposition to the idea of religious freedom, the pastor does not believe your fellow image bearer is worthy of agency. Quote, it means you think so little of the kindness of God, which leads us to repentance, that you would prefer the force of the state. It also means you prefer outward conformity over inner charge. History is littered with bloody, heinous examples of powerful people, who used, their opposition of religious freedom to imprison and kill their detractors, end quote. Southwestern Baptist, I cannot talk. Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary president Adam Greenway shared the Southern Baptist Convention's teaching on religious liberty, emphasizing that few commitments are more intrinsic to our Baptist identity than this one. The teaching cites more than 12 Bible passages when asserting that, quote, the state owes to every church protection and full freedom in the pursuit of its spiritual ends, end quote. After, quote, in providing for such freedom, no ecclesiastical group or denomination should be favored by the state more than others, end quote, Greenway wrote. After viewing MacArthur's entire sermon, a conservative radio host by the name of Eric Erickson has offered his interpretation of MacArthur's analysis. Quote, he's not talking about the ability of different faiths, and this is where you get into some of the defenses of him. He's not talking about the ability of different faiths to worship in a multi-ethnic country of different faiths. He's talking about Christians believing Christianity is true and all other religions are false and don't really give you freedom. End quote. Again, that's not what he said. It could be that's what he meant. I, again, don't think that John MacArthur is a theonomist who thinks that we should start executing atheists and homosexuals and stuff like that. I don't believe that. But that is the words that came out of his mouth, right? That's just a fact. If he meant something like, we don't believe in religious plurality, then he could have said that. He could have said, I don't believe in ecumenism. He could have said, I don't believe in pluralism. He could have said that the idea that a religiously diverse society is good is wrong. He could have said this in a bunch of different ways, but instead he says, I don't fight for religious freedom because that would be idolatry. I mean, again, just choose your words better, right? And I know obviously there's going to be people who watch this program who are probably going to take issue with the fact that I'm criticizing John MacArthur. But John MacArthur just handed ammunition over to our enemies on a silver platter because of a stupid articulation of words that he likely did not mean. And again, I am giving him the benefit of the doubt, saying that he did not mean these words, because that's the good option here. The bad option here is that John MacArthur actually meant to choose those words deliberately because he meant them, in which case, honestly, I would say that's a pretty massive error. Again, I don't think that that's what John MacArthur believes, but if that is what he believes, that would kind of cause me to question him in general, if I'm being honest. But nonetheless, more specifically, he was talking about the habit of secular governments to up the persecution in this country every time those governments claim they support religious freedom. Erickson continued, and this is really one of the defenses I gave earlier. Obama was big into religious freedom while he was suing nuns. Gavin Newsom loves him some religious freedom and shut down churches. And of course, this particular argument against the secularists and the neocons is true, right? It is absolutely the case that a lot of times people who are against Christianity like to use the phraseology religious freedom or separation of church and state only when it makes the Christian, the Christian faith less, robust, right? When it makes it less prominent, when it makes it less public, right? And or have it used in a different way when it makes other faiths more robust and more public, right? And that is absolutely a fair criticism. But again, this is what he said, right? It's a simple matter of choosing words. Words have meaning. They have actual value. If you mean something, say the thing that you mean. Don't say this other thing that, again, just provides ammunition to the progressives on a silver platter. MacArthur lamented the coronavirus worship restrictions Erickson was referring to early in his sermon, which primarily reflected on how the coronavirus pandemic and the events of the preceding year provided him with 2020 clarity. Good pun. MacArthur's church relied on religious freedom and First Amendment arguments when it sued California in 2020 over the state's restriction in in-person indoor worship. And again, I think I don't think that John MacArthur is being a hypocrite there. I think he just didn't choose his words wisely, right? I mean, I'm just being frank with that. But it still is something that, again, needs to be responded to, because people do need to understand that this is not acceptable, really, right? You can't make points this poorly, because if any of the potential interpretations of his words from his supporters are true, you got me fooled. And that doesn't mean that's not what he meant, but it does certainly mean that he did not do a good job, right? It's kind of like when people were criticizing Ted Cruz for saying that the January 6th guys were terrorists, and then he went on to Tucker Carlson, Ted Cruz did, and said, well, I mean specifically, because I've always said, and this is Ted's words, I've always said that anybody who attacks law enforcement with malicious intent is a terrorist. And so, when referring to the select few people who did that in the January 6th, whatever you want to call it, I guess riot or whatever. We'll call it a riot, fine. I was referring to those people in particular, that small group of people, as terrorists and not the whole group, right? And everybody said, and Tucker Carlson even called him out on it. He's like, well, I just think that you, like, if it's simply that's a really dumb error, right? It's the same thing here. If you meant something different, then you should have chosen words that did not communicate exactly what it is that we're telling you communicated, right? This, from the phraseology, I don't support religious freedom, that's idolatry, you do not get, hey, I think it's ridiculous that you can put up a Baphomet statue, but you can't put up the 10 Commandments. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I just don't understand the English language that I grew up speaking. But those are fundamentally different statements. Let's see. With both governments agreeing to pay the church $800,000 in legal fees. Let's see. Erickson summarized MacArthur's point on religious freedom as when the world starts talking about religious freedom, it tends to mean we're coming for you, Christians. And again, if that's the point he's trying to make, that's a fair point. That's not what he said. So we have a problem here. But nonetheless, if that's what he's trying to make, if that's the point he's trying to make, that is true. And actually you have here him saying the radio host defended that claim as just true, adding that that is what MacArthur was talking about. The religious freedom platitude masks the persecutor of Christ's church. Excuse me. Responding to French, Allie Beth Stuckey, a conservative commentator and podcast host with The Blaze, stated that she disagreed with MacArthur's comments, but not for the same reasons as French. Quote, anyone who knows anything about MacArthur knows he's not arguing for implementing theocracy, end quote. And I agree with her. Quote, he's actually saying that Christians shouldn't completely concern themselves with fighting for religious liberty, because even if Christian worship became illegal, the church would continue to do what she has always done, obey God, and I do disagree that supporting religious liberty is supporting idolatry, end quote. So she comes to very similar conclusions to what I come to. It is interesting that Stuckey and Erickson, listening to the same sermon and wanting to defend MacArthur, come to completely different conclusions about what he's saying, which indicates to me that exactly what I'm saying is accurate. The man just completely biffed this one, right? And that's fine. This stuff does happen. But it is something that I think, bare minimum, he should issue a clarification, right? Bare minimum, he should just let us know if, hey, I was trying to communicate something, chose my words poorly, this is what I meant, right? But, I mean, this is a pretty massive screw-up, I think. This was, again, just providing your enemies with a Thanksgiving dinner, a feast, a banquet to just run wild with. And they are running wild with it. They're absolutely running wild with it. Let's see, going further down in the January 2021 sermon where MacArthur made the comments in question. The January 2021 sermon where MacArthur made the comments in question lasted for more than an hour. And by the way, you should absolutely listen to the whole sermon. Far longer than the nearly 2-minute long video clip shared by Sheffield. MacArthur elaborated on his concerns with superficial Christianity, specifically decrying the efforts of other Christian leaders to affiliate themselves with social justice movement. And there's more to be read here. I'll go ahead and drop this in the comment section, or in the live chat rather, but we've already been going for 40 minutes and I have a lot of other stuff I want to talk about. I do see here, Sandy C says, pray they choke on the banquet. Absolutely. Absolutely. Definitely hope that it backfires right in their face. But nonetheless. It is interesting here. We got Nicholas Proclaimer Messiah, and thank you for being here, says, C shoots MacArthur in the back and says MacArthur is handing over to the enemies. Well, it obviously you have every right to believe whatever it is that you like, but with respect, Brother Nicholas, I'm not the one who said that religious liberty was akin to idolatry. That was Pastor MacArthur. Pastor MacArthur, again, either meant something that is detestable, which I don't believe, or he absolutely biffed on his communication and needs to do better. Because if he did not mean that the supporting of somebody's right to follow whatever religion they see fit is a good thing, if he did not mean that the supporting of that as a good thing is idolatrous, is negative, is bad, is wrong, right? If that's not what he meant, then he should have not communicated precisely that. Because it's what he said, and then it's what he said again, and then it's what he said again, and then it's what he said again, and then it's what he said again. Like he reiterated this time and time and time and time again. And yeah, I'm for one not going to be so worried about the left that I'm going to refuse to call people out. Even when it is something where I'm saying, and I've reiterated this multiple times, I don't think that he is a theocrat, right? But at the minimum, he absolutely chose his words in a very inarticulate manner. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and go to our next article. It's actually going to be our headline article for today. And that is, excuse me, let me go ahead and find where it is here. I don't know why it's not pulling up. This will be frustrating to me if I can't find it. 1 second, friends. There it is. All right. The Supreme Court has blocked President Joe Biden's vaccine mandate for businesses, but they did not block President Joe Biden's vaccine mandate for healthcare workers. This happened yesterday. This is actually not something I was expecting. If you guys have been watching this program, you would know that I have said very plainly that I do not trust Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, or Coney Barrett, yeah. And that I thought that they would end up probably ruling in favor of the vaccine mandates. As it turns out, I was wrong. And I'm very happy to be wrong in this particular situation, although they didn't go quite as far as I would have. I do wish that they had struck down the healthcare workers mandate as well. I am pleased to say I was wrong about what their position would be on the large business mandate. And in fact, they have ruled against it, saying that it is unconstitutional for it to be in place at this time. Let's go ahead and read more about it. Supreme Court blocks Biden COVID vaccine mandate for businesses and allows healthcare worker rule. This is originally from CNBC. Obviously, there's tons of different articles that are talking about this as well. So you've probably already read maybe 3 or 4 different articles on this. This is one of those news stories where I'm like the 1,000th guy to give his opinion, right? Which, to be fair, so was the other one, right? But nonetheless, this was originally published yesterday. The Supreme Court on Thursday blocked the Biden administration from enforcing its sweeping vaccine or test requirements for private large companies. But the conservative majority court allowed a vaccine mandate to stand for medical facilities that take Medicare or Medicaid payments. The OSHA mandate required that workers at a business with 100 or more employees get vaccinated or submit a negative COVID test weekly to enter the workplace. Getting into the actual article here. Let me go ahead and actually zoom this in because it looks like that text is pretty small. The Supreme Court on Thursday blocked the Biden administration from enforcing its sweeping vaccine or test requirements for large private companies, but allowed a vaccine mandate to stand for medical facilities that take Medicare or Medicaid payments. Quick note before we continue. There is a little bit of a precedent here. It's not the first time this precedent has been set, but the precedent is if you're taking government money, then the government does have a right to tell you what you can and cannot do, right? Obviously, this isn't the first time such a precedent has been set. Obviously, for example, people like the Native Americans who live on reservations and get reparation checks are very well aware of this rule that the government has where it's, hey, we're definitely going to tell you what to do in ways that is not actually constitutionally legal if you accept our money. In other words, it becomes constitutionally legal because of the fact that you've accepted our money. And that's something that you're again seeing here, right? They're saying, hey, these different medical facilities that are actually taking Medicare or Medicaid payments, that's payment from the government. If you're going to take payment from the government, you have to be completely vaccinated, right? Even if you are a private medical facility, you're accepting Medicaid, you're accepting government dollar, then you're going to have to comply with some new government fine print, right? And that is something that is incredibly common. It's one of the big things people have feared when it comes to the stimulus checks. And here we have it, happening yet again, where the Supreme Court is saying it's not actually okay for the United States government to mandate that private employees should have to, or private employers, should have to force their employees to get a vaccine mandate, which of course I agree with. But if you have a medical facility that is taking government money, then it actually is okay for the government to tell them their employees must be vaccinated. So beware that in the future, whenever you see these kinds of situations where it's like, hey, the government might be able to give me some kind of benefit because thus and such. Beware this ruling when the Supreme Court had said, and it's not the first time, it won't be the last time, but just note it in your little note taker in your head, right? Beware this ruling because it is very clearly saying, yes, private companies do not have, the federal government does not have the right to force private companies to do things. But if those private companies are getting in bed with that government, then the rules are different. And that's very important for us to point out. A lot of people get tricked up in that. In fact, that's how the whole concept of 501c3 is currently operated, right? The government says, hey, churches, we'll go ahead and let you be tax exempt, but you can't preach anything political over the pulpit. You win some, you lose some, right? It's a whole game of you scratch my back, I scratch yours. The rulings came 3 days after the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, commonly known as OSHA, after their emergency measure for businesses started to take effect. So, in other words, it was in effect for a total of 3 days. The mandate required that workers at businesses with 100 or more employees get vaccinated or submit a negative COVID test weekly to enter the workplace. It also required unvaccinated workers to wear masks indoors and at work. Quote, although Congress has indisputably given OSHA the power to regulate occupational dangers, it has not given that agency the power to regulate public health more broadly, end quote, the court wrote in an unsigned opinion. So in other words, OSHA does have a right to say things like, hey, you got to have your food at least 6 inches above the ground. You can't have a dangling, heavy object high in the air or something along those lines. Something that could fall down and hit somebody, something like that. All these different rules that they're allowed to say. But that does not apply to things like public health mandates, right? It applies to occupational hazards in the workplace. But it does not apply to anything like mask mandate, vaccine mandate, quarantine, stuff like that, right? That is outside of OSHA's purview, according to the court. Excuse me. Quote, requiring the vaccination of 84 million Americans selected simply because they work for employers with more than 100 employees certainly falls into the latter category, end quote, the court wrote. Liberal Justices Stephen Breyer, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan dissented, writing that the majority has usurped the power of Congress, the president, and OSHA without legal basis. Quote, in the face of a still raging pandemic, this court tells the agency charged with protecting worker safety that it may not do so in all the workplaces needed, end quote, they said in their dissent. Quote, as disease and death continue to mount, this court tells the agency that it cannot respond in the most effective way possible, although without legal basis, the court usurps a decision that rightfully belongs to others It undercuts the capacity of the responsible federal officials acting well within the scope of their authority to protect American workers from grave danger, end quote. Now, I hope you guys are actually listening to what the OSHA president is saying here, because he's all sorts of what would you say? I don't want to say anything that's crass. He's all sorts of hurt, though, in his rear area about this particular ruling. He don't like it at all. He's quite offended. Let's go ahead and read that again so we can see just how offended he actually is. He says, quote, in the face of a still raging pandemic, this court tells the agency charged with protecting worker safety that it may not do so in all the workplaces needed. That's the OSHA president's interpretation. Why? Because he says, as disease and death continues to mount, this court tells the agency that it cannot respond in the most effective way possible. By the way, they're saying like you need a 5th booster shot now. I don't know. If that's the most effective way possible, I would just like to suggest suicide because we're all dead. Obviously, I'm joking. But the point being, if this is the only way we're going to stop from dying, is this COVID vaccine, you might as well just accept the fact that you're dead because the COVID vaccine ain't working. By the way, subscribe on Rumble because this is the kind of thing that's going to get this video taken down. In the face of the still raging pandemic, this court, sorry, I just read that, in the most effective way possible, without legal basis, he says, without legal basis, right? So in other words, the court does not have the right to tell OSHA that it does not have the right to tell 84 million Americans that they must be vaccinated in order to work, according to the OSHA president. Without legal basis, the court usurps a decision that rightfully belongs to others. Who does that sound like to you? Who is usurping a decision that rightfully belonged to others? Oh, yeah, that would be OSHA, right? OSHA is sitting here saying a private company cannot decide to respond to this the way they see fit with their own enterprise. OSHA is saying a private individual cannot decide to put foreign elements into their body or not put foreign elements into their body as they see fit. In other words, it is OSHA who is doing exactly what OSHA is accusing the Supreme Court of doing. Have you met the pot? I hear he's a wonderful fella. Or maybe the kettle. I don't know. Whatever. It undercuts the capacity of the responsible federal officials who have done such an excellent job thus far. I hope you can hear the sarcasm in my voice. Acting well within the scope of their authority. According to what document? Show me where in the Constitution it says that OSHA even has a right to exist. Yeah, I said it. Abolish OSHA. Okay? It has no right to exist, constitutionally speaking. Let alone that you have the right to force 84 million Americans to get a vaccine. Go ahead and show me the documents. I'd love to see it. Oh, you can't because they don't exist. Shocker. Acting well within the scope of their authority to protect American workers from grave danger. Grave danger, of course. You know what it reminds me of, actually, when he says that? If any of you guys ever watched SpongeBob SquarePants, I know that was kind of more my thing because I'm only 23, right? So it was, on while I was a kid. But if you're a little older, maybe you had kids. But regardless, Mermaid Man, whenever he hears, oh, there's evil afoot, and he's like, evil, and he starts running around and acting like a completely senile geriatric old man. It's hysterical. But that's what these people remind me of when they're talking about grave. Oh my goodness, grave danger. What are we gonna do about the grave danger? I don't know. I hope you can tell I don't take this thing seriously anymore because I really don't. I really, really don't. President Joe Biden, in a statement, said something that somebody else told him to. What did this article actually say? Said the Supreme Court chose to block requirements that are life-saving for workers. I wonder if you'd feel the same about things that block abortion. Anyways, Biden called on, or better yet, things that involve not, bombing brown kids. Anyways, sorry, I always have to throw out there that the Democrats like to bomb brown kids because they think that the conservatives are so racist. But anyways, Biden called on states and businesses to step up and voluntarily institute vaccination requirements to protect workers, customers, and the broader community. Quote, the court has ruled that my administration cannot use the authority granted to it by Congress to require this measure, but that does not stop me from using my voice as president to advocate for employers to do the right thing to protect Americans' health and economy, end quote. I don't know when Congress gave him this authority, and I don't know where the Constitution says Congress can give him this authority. But regardless, nobody really listens to Joe Biden's voice anyway, so I guess he can use his voice for whatever he likes. Labor Secretary Marty Walsh called the court's decision a major setback for the health and safety of workers. Of course he did. She. I guess I don't know if Marty is a guy or a girl. Anyways, vowing OSHA would use its existing authority to make sure businesses are protecting employees. The American Medical Association, which is just incredibly trustworthy, don't you know? One of the world's largest doctors groups one of the largest doctors groups in the nations. The world is not there. The word world is not there. Let me rephrase this sentence because I just said it terribly. The AMA, one of the largest doctors groups in the nation, said it is deeply disappointed, quote, in the face of a continually evolving COVID-19 pandemic that poses a serious danger to the health of our nation. So serious, in fact, that everybody is literally ignoring it. Sorry, I forgot I'm reading a quote and probably shouldn't add my own thoughts. Anyways, in the face of continually evolving COVID-19 pandemic that poses a serious danger to the health of our nation, the Supreme Court today halted one of the most effective tools in the fight against further transmission and death from this aggressive virus, end quote, AMA President Gerald Harmon said. Notice that all of these people are Joe Biden appointed political cronies, right? They're all bureaucrats. In other words, it's not actually doctors that are saying this. It's the head of the AMA, a government organization, or OSHA, a government organization. We know about that. Or Joe Biden, who heads the United States government. It's kind of like I recently saw this video from the Alternate History Hub, and he was talking about how the Canadian government, to stop the Inuit people from traveling and being nomadic, they slaughtered all of their sled dogs in mass, right? Because if you don't have sled dogs, then you can't travel over the inhospitable terrain. So you have to make a village, and therefore you're easier to control, right? And the Canadian government brilliantly investigated itself when this came to everybody's attention, and then decided that it had found no wrongdoing in itself. And ain't that just one of the most hilarious things you've ever heard in your life, right? And it's exactly what you're seeing here, right? Of course, I expect the government to tell me that the government is acting completely within the authority of the government. Obviously, right? The question is, does the Constitution or something outside of the government, something that potentially is a foundation for the government, say something similar? Don't think it does. Let's see. We agree with the government that the Health and Human Services Secretary's rule falls within the authorities that Congress has conferred upon him, end quote, said the majority, writing that this rule fits neatly within the language of the statute. I have to skip over some stuff because my computer's about to die, so we kind of have to end this soon. Justices Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, Neil Gorsuch, and Amy Coney Barrett, 4 of the 6 conservatives on the 9-seat bench, dissented. Quote, I do not think the federal government is likely to be able to show that Congress has authorized the unprecedented step of compelling over 10 million, healthcare workers to be vaccinated on pain of being fired, Alito wrote in his dissent. Biden, in a statement, said the vaccine requirements for healthcare workers will save the lives of patients, doctors, and nurses, and we will enforce it, the president said of his mandate. And by the way, that particular part of the mandate, remember, is still valid, right? They only struck down Biden's rule for private companies. They did not strike down Biden's mandate for medical providers who actually accept Medicaid and Medicare. If you're a medical provider and you accept Medicaid and Medicare and you're a private company, the Supreme Court just said that Biden does have the right to tell you must forcibly vaccinate your employees, So let's not take this as an absolute victory. It's not. It is a victory. It is not an absolute victory. It's a Pyrrhic victory at best. We lost a lot in this case, right? Because that's a big deal, especially when we have people walking out all over the country, walking out of the nursing facilities and stuff like that, due to these COVID-19 restrictions, right? And by the way, if Medicaid and Medicare is meant to help people like the elderly and the less fortunate, which I'm skeptical of its actual efficacy, but I do myself use this stuff, so I guess I can't say 100% that it doesn't work, right? I think most people in my group do, because it's not really possible for us to afford the rest, right? That being said, I have very limited options as to what I can and cannot do, medically speaking, right? So I also, I have experienced some of the shortcomings of Medicaid by virtue of my using it. But that being said, let's assume that the argument is correct and that this actually does help those who are impoverished, those who are elderly, all that other kind of stuff. Let's assume that I could not possibly be doing any better, which maybe I could, who knows, right? But I just want to use myself as an example because I don't, not blaming anyone else. Well, now a company has to make a decision. Do you stop accepting the Medicaid money and therefore stop helping the elderly and the underprivileged? Or do you fire a bunch of your employees or potentially violate your own conscience? So let's not be deceived here. This was a great ruling in many ways, but it's a deceptive ruling too. We still took a massive blow today, or yesterday, because that's when this ruling was made, in regards to the rights of healthcare officials and those who own private healthcare offices to decide whether or not they will actually vaccinate their employees. Now, to be clear, you can still run private medical practice and not take Medicare, Medicaid. But that's the sacrifice you're going to have to make, is not take Medicare, Medicaid if indeed you don't want to force your employees to get vaccinated, which, of course, is your right. But with that, friends, I think that's about all that we have for today. We're about done. So I want to thank you guys for being here today. I want to say, if you did like this video, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. Of course, what good is a message without an audience to hear it? So please consider getting this out to all the different social media platforms which you frequent, and definitely also consider getting on some of the alternative social media platforms like Parler, Gab, Minds, definitely Rumble, where you should subscribe to the Synagogue, because I will absolutely be at some point getting this removed. Sorry, just Sandy C said the rest had tapped out. Let's see. Yeah, I guess it looks like a couple people did actually jump out. That's definitely perfectly fine, though. I know that Nicholas didn't particularly like my opinions here on MacArthur, but that's perfectly fine. He has every right to voice his opinion in my... Sorry about that. Hope you guys can hear me. My computer just died, so I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye on my phone. So with that, I want to thank you guys for being here. Remind you to please like, share, and subscribe if you like this content and think that it is worth it, think that I'm doing good journalism here, independent journalism, I guess you could call it. Please do consider subscribing to the channel and helping to help me make this a career by contributing either through one-time donations to the Patreon or through a subscription to the Patreon or one-time donation to the PayPal. Please do so with trepidation, only if you think that what I am putting out here is worth it. You can definitely guarantee that I will always be giving you honest, conservative content and my undiluted is the word I'm looking for, opinions here. So at the bare minimum, there is that for you, right? But nonetheless, I do greatly appreciate you guys. Want to remind you that you are my fellow watchdogs. Think like a Neanderthal and ask yourself this question: in the face of Armageddon, will you compromise?